First of all, I want to welcome you all to, this is actually the 7th year that we've had the Artist in Residence program. And our previous Artists in Residence include, in totality, the actors John Turturro and Kathleen Chalfant, playwrights John Patrick Shanley and our own John Robin Bates, and directors Doug Hughes and Joe Montello. This is the Hurricane Sandy edition of Artists in Residence. We are not in our real home, in a real theater with real stage lights and not green on the walls, which I apologize for. But we are temporarily relocated here on 16th Street, so I'm welcoming all of you. I think we have some alumni here. We certainly have tons of students and some guests. And this is generally a fairly informal event where we have our artists in residence and someone of a similar discipline chatting for a little bit in the first segment, and then really opening it up to you guys, particularly the students, for questions. We've had an incredible week with Sir David Hare. It's been amazing. He has spent time with actors working on thesis projects. He has spent time with history class in Theatre of British Anger. He has spent time with all of the playwrights in a session, and this is sort of the capstone of the week. So we're very excited, and David has been expansively generous with his time and his talent and his insight, and it has been a buoyant week for the students, and we're very, very excited and appreciative. But let me tell you who we have. John Robin Bates, and this is, I'm probably going to embarrass both of them, but I will just let you know a few things. John Robin Bates' plays include The Film Society, The Substance of Fire, 3 Hotels, A Fair Country, 10 Unknowns, Ms. Lansky's Zelensky, a new version of Ibsen's Hedda Gabler, which was produced on Broadway in 2001, and The Paris Letter. He is the creator of the hit ABC TV show Brothers and Sisters, which he also executive produced for the first 2 seasons. His PBS film version of 3 Hotels won a Humanitas Award. Other screenplays include The Substance of Fire, based on his play, and People I Know, starring Al Pacino. He has written episodes of West Wing and Alias. He is a Pulitzer finalist at least once, maybe multiple times, a Guggenheim and NEA Fellow, and an American Academy of Arts and Letters Award winner, the founding member and former artistic director of Naked Angels Theater Company. His play, Other Desert Cities, which was on Broadway this past season, among other awards, was nominated for a Lortel, Drama Desk, and Outer Critics Circle Award, winning the latter. And of course, Sir David Hare. This was really tricky to get into a few words, but I will give you a little taste. Sir David Hare was recently named by the Sunday Times as one of the 50 most influential Britons of the last 50 years. And I could probably stop there. He's the author of 28 plays for the stage, 16 of which have been presented at the National Theatre in London. Hare was awarded the BAFTA Award in 1979 for Best Single Play for Licking Hitler, the New York Drama Critics Circle Award in 1983 for Best Foreign Play for Plenty, the Berlin Film Festival Golden Bear in 1985 for Wetherby, the Laurence Olivier Award in 1990 for Best New Play for Racing Demon, London Theatre Critics Award in 1990 for Racing Demon, and the Drama Desk Award in 1999 for Outstanding One-Person Show for Via Dolorosa, and he was knighted in 1998. And this is just a few words that Robbie happened to say, coincidentally, about Sir David Hare. Over nearly half a century, Sir David Hare has been the exemplar of the theater artist as humanist. No other living playwright has so consistently and brilliantly explored the intersection between our public and private lives. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome John Robin Bates and Sir David Hare.
Thank you, everybody. All my questions are on here. Why is that even funny? I'm not going to embarrass you because I almost embarrassed you making a toast to him in a very crowded restaurant. And it was sort of mortifying for an Englishman to have to endure that more than But I will just say I love Mr. Hare as a playwright and as a person. And I don't love many people in either capacity.
And rarely both.
In fact, you're it, basically, for both. I want to start off. I want to start off by asking about Via Dolorosa, which is a piece Mr. Hare wrote, or Sir David. David. That examines the intersection and the impossible intersection and dichotomies of the Palestinian conflict from both sides of the coin after having spent some time in Israel. What year was that?
I think I went to Israel and the Palestinian Territory, as it was then called, in 1997, or certainly the play appeared in 1998, yeah.
And I'm going to jump around, but just given the events on the ground in the last few days in Gaza, what have you been thinking about?
Well, the situation's extremely familiar.
Yeah.
You know, there's nothing. The problem between the communities and indeed within the communities, which is partly what Via Dolorosa was about. In other words, what happened was that I was sent by the Royal Court with the idea of writing a play about the Mandate period. And it has a wonderful international department, the Royal Court, and it goes around the world creating little royal courts. It's done royal courts in Chile, it's done royal courts in Moscow. It introduces countries to the idea of new playwriting being something that's worth doing all over the world. And it had a project in Israel. And so they wanted me to go out to write a play about the Mandate period. It was immediately clear to me, because nothing in Israel or Palestine was what I expected. It was completely not what I was expecting. Just at the most basic level, the divisions within the societies were as profound as the divisions between the societies. So I came back going, hey, I want to write about this. And what happened was that I then was absolutely horrified at the prospect of enactment of what I had seen, because everything that I had seen would be false when it was enacted. The idea of some London Jewish actors who in no way resemble Israelis standing holding machine guns at some awful little set on a stage, and then the few light-skinned Asians that we could find, or some Arabs, or a bit of this, you know, pretending to play Palestinians. Oh, this Pakistani actor's not too bad, but, oh, you know, maybe we can get one Palestinian. Falsity just came out of the idea of this play at every level. I just thought it will be false. And indeed, I'm sorry to say, I have seen such plays where people try and enact what's happening in the Middle East with pitifully dissimilar resources and people who have no experience of what they're trying to act. And you just go, this can't be right. So that's why I decided that instead, since the only way the situation could be dramatized was by me telling the audience about it. It had to be a monologue, and it had to be me who acted it. But the inconvenience was that I had never acted in my life, which was a bit of a drawback.
But I don't think it was, if any of you have seen it, and there's a film of it.
Yeah.
It's in fact your own we become you. And part of it is the uncertainty of not being an actor that allows us access to your experience.
Well, I think a lot of actors became fascinated by it. What happened was that Stephen Daldry directed it, and I had to basically get Stephen Daldry to teach me to act. And I put myself completely in his hands, and I often felt he was taking the piss. I often felt he thinks it's going to be terribly funny if this playwright makes a complete idiot of himself, and that this is his idea of a real joke. And I particularly had a problem, I don't know if any actor in the room has a problem, I had a problem with emotion. In other words, it just, well, Obviously, you do have this problem. He would say to me, now there was a model of Jerusalem that appeared from beneath the stage and went up, and I had to look absolutely rapt by it. And Stephen would say, you're deeply moved by this, you know. And I would say, but I'm not deeply moved by it. It's a little model that's coming up, and it just doesn't move me at all. And he said, no, but you've got to pretend to be moved. And I would say, I find this sort of morally disgusting. To pretend to be moved by something you're not moved by. This is not right. And Stephen said, yeah, this is what we call acting. And it's a conundrum, isn't it? And so I felt horrible. I felt horrible when I did it. This is the bit I looked forward to least all evening, the bit when I was moved. And because I just felt a horrible fake. I just felt, oh, I'm doing something, I'm pretending to do it, but inside I'm just dying. And I would kind of say to Stephen, now how moved do I look now? You know, is this convincing you? And Stephen would say, yeah, no, you're convincing me. It looks to me like you're moved. But I would have no register within myself to know whether I was convincing in this passage at all or not. But I could see that it was necessary to pretend. But actors then became fascinated by this kind of acting, and a lot of actors came to see it. And Simon Callow, who wrote the most cutting, but in theory admiring review of it, he said he went out onto the stage entirely unprotected by an actor's shield of technique, he said.
I think they were, I think that they, and I think all the other actors here, I think they were jealous. I think he was jealous, actually.
I can see it worried actors.
Yeah.
Because if any old idiot can do it, and also can move people more than the pretense moves them, because clearly my job was to show how much Israel and Palestine had affected me. And a lot of people found the play much more moving when I couldn't act at all.
Yeah.
And they found the fact that I looked so frightened. When I was in London, I was very, very frightened. And so going out, I looked as if I was in a state of blind terror, which, like an animal, they just were terribly moved by me because I was out there and looked, you know, so unhappy out there. But they also could see that the only reason that I could possibly be putting myself through this torture was because I had something that I really seriously wanted to say and knew that only I could say. And by the time I got to New York, I had a little more technique. But I don't know that that was necessarily a great deal of help. But actors, the greatest moment in New York was Jason Robards, who was too ill with emphysema to come up the stairs. So he shouted up the stairs at me, "You're a great actor." And I said, "Don't be ridiculous." So I went down the stairs and said, "I'm not a great actor. I might possibly be a performer, but I'm not an actor. It's not the same thing at all." But it was that Jason Robards thought that what I was doing was acting. Whereas another very famous actor said, "You reminded me of a child at a party who gets up to do a turn." And who just doesn't care what anybody thinks. They're just going to do their turn.
That's really not the point of Via Dolorosa, is it?
No.
No. Yeah. Wow. Have you kept in touch with any of the of the people you interviewed and spent time with?
Not David Grossman, you know,
Yeah,
who's a famous novelist. I do occasionally hear from David because he's just such an incredible voice for his, you know, for his country, really.
Not the last, but one of the great humanists.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you ever do the show there?
No. I wouldn't do the show there because basically people who, let's say the politics of doing it really put me off. In other words, anything that you do
Yeah.
there is basically run by one side.
Yeah.
In other words, it's run by the Israelis. And the Israelis said to me, you can do it in Tel Aviv and Ramallah. But Daniel Barenboim had had a very bad experience, which was that he had said he would only play if he played in Tel Aviv and Ramallah. He played the concert in Tel Aviv, and then at the end of the concert in Tel Aviv, they came to him and said, the security situation has deteriorated, you can no longer play in Ramallah. And Barenboim was absolutely furious because he felt he'd been conned. But to me, also the Palestinians started saying, you can do the show in Ramallah, but for your own safety, you will have to have men with machine guns on either side of the stage. And so I thought this was probably not a good idea for me. And anyway, they know about the situation. They know about the things I'm talking about. It was the West that needed to hear about it.
What was the reaction? I mean, I remember in New York, vaguely, a kind of strange, I can say this because I'm Jewish, faux Jewish outrage at times at the piece. Did you come up against that at all?
Not much.
Yeah.
I, on the contrary, was very surprised at how open everybody was. And I was very, I had some Palestinians in London who didn't like it. And there was a degree of animosity, but it was honest dissent. I don't think that would be the situation now, I'm afraid. In other words, I think in 1999, people were much more open-minded, because the piece is not polemical, it's not on one side or the other, but it does work from the assumption that both sides are human beings. And this I'm sorry to say this, but in parts of this country, this is a radical assumption. When we did Stuff Happens, the second act of Stuff Happens begins with a Palestinian, and it puts the Palestinian point of view. And in the Mark Taper Forum in Los Angeles, I don't know if you know that theater, but it has vomitoria through which the actors appear and through which the audience also exit. So regularly every night, whenever a Palestinian got up to speak in the theater, people would leave. And when leaving, they would pass actors who were waiting to go on. And the actors would say to them, do you object to what she's saying? And people would say, no, we don't object to what she's saying, we just object to a Palestinian being represented on the American stage. That's what they objected to. Just that a voice of a Palestinian should not be heard on an American stage. And that really shocked me very deeply, actually.
Does that relates actually to something I was going to ask you. How do you perceive or even account for the kind of vacuum of an American political theater, the absence almost entirely?
Oh, that question.
I mean, I think about it all the time because, whatever one does is political, whatever the way you love is. And I don't see the separation, but there seems to be sort of, it seems to be absent here, that most actual playwriting is a form of, there are different things being explored than our relationship to the larger world.
Yeah. I don't know how to begin to answer this question because the cultural gulf is so enormous, isn't it? Yesterday, talking about this at the playwrights class, then the first thing I would obviously say is that because we lived in a continent in which there were world wars that were extremely traumatic, countries were occupied, at a very basic level, we believe that history is blowing through the room. And we believe that we are lucky to be on solid ground at all because the solid ground may be removed. And so you can't talk about, or I don't want to talk about something called the human condition. I don't know what that means. I think human beings are different according to where they are, where history has put them, what social factors obtain at the time. I don't think I am like a Chinese peasant. I think a Chinese peasant is profoundly different from me. And the drama is about defining the ways in which we're different as well as the ways in which we're alike. As you can see, a whole lot of drama, therefore, is not so interesting to me. I sort of wish Samuel Beckett had written his play about working in the French Resistance. you know, everyone says Waiting for Godot is about working in the resistance. It is, but it's made so abstract that for me it's drained of interest.
Yeah.
I would be much more interested, because I think the most interesting thing Beckett did in his life was fight in the French resistance. I would love to know what, but he doesn't want to tell me that. In the same way, Harville, you know, Harville was at the very center of the most interesting events of our time. He watched the wall come down, and if you listen to Harville talking about what then happened and why, you know, Eastern Europe isn't the way we all hoped it might become, and what then went on, you kind of go, my God, Harville is the man to write about this. Instead of which he wrote an allegory about King Lear and his daughters. And I just, so for me, the only way of thinking about drama is about on the assumption that the characters will be deeply affected by how they got there and what is going on at the time. And if you don't somehow suggest that, then you're not, it's not of great interest to me. Now, if you're a genius, like Anton Chekhov, you can do it in a room. And, you know, everyone always says of Chekhov, oh, you can feel the revolution coming, or it's all about the liberation of the slaves. And it is, because he's a genius. But the assumption that just putting any old group of people in a room and that somehow you're always going to know, but from that group of, he's cleverer than he looks, Chekhov. He's doing it. He's seeking to do a social and historical thing. He just happens to be able to do it by a different method. And if you actually look at Chekhov's life, he's deeply engaged socially. What's he doing? Prison reform, you know, looking at conditions in hospitals. He's one of the most socially committed writers who ever lived. He's just developed this extraordinary aesthetic whereby he hopes to be able to do what we perhaps do more nakedly. He does by allusion and suggestion, you know.
And you think, going back to something you said previously, that our separation, the American separateness, and how does that kind of it kind of incubates an ahistoricism in some way?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I don't understand this country. You know, we talked yesterday about what?
Speak freely.
No, we talked. We talked yesterday about this extraordinary remark in the New York Times by the second-string critic, who's called Charles Isherwood, and he wrote an article in the New York Times in which he said, any play that has the word Guantanamo in the title, I just want to go home, eat popcorn, and watch Sex and the City.
Yes, he does, exactly. That's what he wants to do. He's telling you completely the truth about who he is.
And well, when I read that, I thought, if he were a book critic, and if he were working on the literary pages of the New York Times, the literary editor would say to him, Charles, do you think you're in the right job? You know, have you considered whether perhaps, you know, I've given you this book about Guantanamo to review. Do you think you're the right person to review this? So it seems to me, and obviously the Times is the principal criminal, at perpetuating this idea that theatre belongs with essentially juggling, tumbling, miming, you know, torch singing.
Yeah.
It isn't literature. It's a category problem here, that theatre doesn't seem to be thought of as literature. It seems to be thought of as fun. And if it's not fun, it's what's the point, you know? And so it's that cultural assumption about theatre. Whereas I think the expectation, maybe because you have great novelists, maybe because we don't have great novelists, but the novel in America does what, I quoted to the playwrights yesterday this remark of Philip Roth's, where Philip Roth said, I am a novelist because I'm American. And I know what I'm part of. And I'm part of something which is Saul Bellow, John Updike, and I'm part of it. And he said, if I lived in Britain, and he did live in Britain for a while, I'd be a playwright. Because there's no British novel to be part of, whereas there is a British theatre to be part of. And he said, I know I would have spent my life in the theatre if I were British.
That makes so much sense. No, you do feel like a sort of weird outlier here, like you're sort of poised slightly between the West Coast and here a bit, and there's a kind of swirling eddy of compromise and kind of. I want to. Hey, man. I want to ask about the theater company that you were, I guess, founder of, really? Joint stock?
Yeah.
I think people want to know what it was like to why are you laughing? To make collaborative works on that scale. And also, I wanted to ask you if you ever sort of wistfully think about making work in that way again, or are you so past that? So.
Well, Joint Stock was really, although I founded the company, it was run by two directors, Bill Gaskell and Max Stafford Clark. And the idea was that there didn't seem to us any reason why experimental work shouldn't be on the same scale as mainstream work. But because the first thing we did was a play about the Chinese Revolution called Fan Shen, we used the methods of the revolution to rehearse. We talked about this yesterday.
Did you beat people up or something? The methods of the revolution?
No, the methods of the revolution were that we were all equal.
Yeah.
So we could not, as directors and writers, go upstairs to complain about the actors. Bill and Max and I made a vow at the beginning that we would never discuss the inadequacies of the actors. Because those of you who are directors and playwrights know that that is the currency of the theatre. Yeah. The currency of the theatre is you work on the floor, then when the rehearsal is over, you go upstairs and you say, why can't that idiot play that line, right? And, you know, you are licensed to talk about them as if they're the animals in the cages and you're the zookeeper. And that status thing, we didn't allow ourselves. The actors were allowed to talk about us. It didn't work. They were, if they wanted, they could. But then when we worked by self-criticism, so that when you ran a scene, the actor had not to criticize other people, they had to criticize themselves. So when the scene was over, then the actor would say, I feel I was very bad in that scene because I failed to do such and such, right? And then the other actor would say, no, it was not your fault, it was my fault, because you couldn't say it's your fault. You know, that you're not allowed to say. You can only work by exploring your own failures. It's a very, very unwieldy method that I would not recommend to anyone not doing a play about the Chinese Revolution. I think it would work. I mean, the company then tried to use this method on other material. And I remember Carol Churchill arriving to find this method and just going, what have these people been smoking? You know, are they really going to do my play like this? But, you know, being Carol, she was game and sort of, you know, leapt in to self-criticism.
Okay, another, like, basic, this is sort of biographical question in a way, but what was it, do you think, in your growing up that contributed to concretizing your becoming an artist, a playwright?
Well, all the classic stuff.
Yeah, so?
A lower middle class upbringing, and loneliness, and only really being able to I just come from the absolute classic background of those people who end up doing what I do.
Yeah.
In other words, which is that, you know, I had an emotionally quite repressed and difficult family life, and I had you know, I was from the lower middle class. I was from the, you know, little semi-detached house. And I was a scholarship boy who was very bright. And so because I was very bright, I was forced up through the class system. And I got everywhere by scholarships. And so I was constantly thrown into institutions where I didn't belong because I didn't understand the codes of those institutions, because they were class-based institutions, and I clearly didn't belong to the class that was running those institutions. And so I was, you know, I hate the word outsider because, you know, I keep reading that Brad Pitt is an outsider, or, you know, and you just go, I don't think so, you know. No, not really, Brad. I think you're somewhere near the center of the culture, you know. It's sort of, it's a word that really, it doesn't mean anything. But on the other hand, I am one step back from it in the sense that I don't understand it. And I appear to be the victim of all sorts of feelings which other people don't appear to have. And I'm sort of feeling that I'm slightly mad because certain things seem blindingly clear to me that are not blindingly clear to everybody else. And then things which everybody else seems to find blindingly clear, I just don't understand at all. And so this, of course, is a tremendous advantage for an artist because, you know, the only way you can express your difference is by creating your little world of your own in which you say, this is how I think the world is, although you bastards all think it's something completely different. But it's obviously not the best way to be a human being. It's quite a painful way to be a human being because you spend your time in bewilderment, really, which I spent a great deal of my adolescence and indeed until I was middle-aged, really, bewildered.
How has your life as a writer changed from being a young writer to being a slightly less young writer now? I mean, what's the sort of internal sea change in terms of the way you see the world, in terms of the way you approach work?
Well, it's difficult because I was both very, you know, I wrote my first play when I was 23, and I was very, very, in a worldly way, successful. The minute I started writing plays, they were incredibly successful. Not incredibly successful, I shouldn't say that. They were successful. But they were also incredibly contentious. So that from the very beginning, people either thought that I was the savior of the British theatre or that I was a complete charlatan, and not even charlatan, I was somebody who must be gone after, stamped out, and destroyed. Bernard Levin, who was on my case, he was an English journalist who was on my case for 20 years, and he ended a review, finally, I wish David Hare would just go away, is what he said. And when you're attracting that level of hostility, it puts you under a very profound self-examination. Of course it does. Because you think, what is it in me that people react so violently to when you don't feel like what you're doing is particularly exceptional. You just think you're doing your job and you're writing plays about the world, and yet something in my project both irritated the hell out of people and indeed continues to irritate the hell out of people.
And what do you think that is?
They felt in the early plays, with Plenty in particular, but also with Knuckle, which was sort of a very bad moment for me. They feel that they are judged and that I am a moralizing prig who writes plays which in which I claim to be superior to them.
Okay.
I don't even begin to analyze.
I mean, you actually, just going to Plenty, you actually address that in the play.
Of course. And also I show that Plenty is a play about the price of living in dissent from the world. Yeah. That's what the play is about. It's about the glory of dissent, but it's also about the price of dissent. You know, this woman is destroyed by her separation from the world. It's perfectly clear what the play's about.
Completely.
But that doesn't stop men, in particular, and remember, you know, men are still dragged to the theatre by women. They don't want to go, but they still are forced to go by their wives. And so men, you know, reacted very, very badly and felt, you know, and also they felt obviously sexually and morally challenged by this woman in that particular play. And so they felt that I was putting myself up above people. And so nothing could be further from the truth. But there is a degree of deliberate misinterpretation of what I do, which I have to deal with.
A kind of comfortable, willful misinterpretation.
Yeah, there is a. When I read what it is that I'm meant to be doing wrong, I kind of go, I don't actually think this is written in good faith. I don't actually believe the person believes it. You know, if you say, oh, well, his plays are all propaganda or whatever, or they're all propaganda for a political point of view. Well, I've never written propaganda for a political point of view. I quite like plays which are propaganda for a political view. I really enjoy them. It's just bad luck I don't happen to write them, you know? But, you know, then when I read, oh, well, he's just a propagandist for well, no, actually, and name a play which is, you know? So when you say, how has it changed? It hasn't really changed because I've always had to conduct myself against this war of opinion. And it's a war which sort of reaches my door and then goes away. But it isn't in any way significant. I've never been able to run away.
I guess what I'm saying is I'm asking or saying is that even looking at a play like Plenty and then moving ahead to Skylight, which is one of the most beautiful plays in the modern theater, there's so much kindness finally in Skylight, and it feels like the kindness of a writer who's endured something and come to accept all of the ambivalence and all of the ambiguities that make up having to live in a world, of having to be around people, and I find that sort of arc in your work really moving, and you see it again. You see it, you know, in Amy's view, you see it all the time, and you feel, I guess I'm not saying, oh, I think you've become a kindler, gentler David Hare, but I do actually think you might have.
No, what happened? Well, we have to put this down to Thatcherism. That's what happened. Crudely, what happened was, you know, when I was a political writer in the 70s, and I was writing about what I thought was the apocalyptic state of Britain, we all expected that at the end of the 1970s, Britain would either explode into civil chaos or it would turn left. It never occurred to any of us it would turn right. Nobody saw that coming. Global capitalism geared up, it deregulated, it became dynamic again, and suddenly the whole world is turning right. And we are a group of socialist playwrights who are standing there scratching our heads and looking like total idiots. And for 4 or 5 years, I couldn't write. How could I write? I was wrong about everything, and I had nothing to write.
And then you wrote Plenty.
No, I'd already written Plenty. Plenty is the last play that I write, which is about, which is apocalyptic, essentially, which is saying, this isn't working, and it's all going to fall apart. When it doesn't fall apart, and then it takes me years to sort out an analysis. I'm not like other playwrights. I can't work without an analysis. A lot of playwrights can work by feel. They don't know what they're doing, and I have the greatest respect for them. But I like to have an analysis. I like to know what I'm thinking, and even if I discover it in the process of writing the play. But at the end of it, I need it to make some coherent political sense to me. That may not be apparent to the audience, but the politics of the play have got to be clear to me, and it's got to be something I agree with. You know, it's got to be something I'm comfortable with. So slowly, Thatcherism happened, and it occurred to me when I started working with the police. I was writing about the police, and I was surprised to find that they were very anti-Thatcher. And this was not what you'd expect. You traditionally think, oh, you know, they're the enforcers, they're the boot boys who do the stuff that's been handed down from Downing Street. No, on the contrary, they disliked Thatcher. And they disliked Thatcher because they said a whole lot of intellectuals have taken over in Downing Street. They've got these theories, like welfare dependency was the fashionable theory. Or, you know, prison works was another theory, right? They've got, and they're a pack of intellectuals. They don't know the daily effect of these policies. We're the people on the front line who actually have to deal with all the damage caused by Thatcherism. We're the people who heal Thatcherism's wounds. So I did begin to find a group of people who I greatly admired. And by and large, these people were, surprisingly, the police, certainly the clergy, because the clergy were essentially social workers who were just handing out soup and advice. They were spending an awful lot of time helping people fill in forms for how to get stoves. You know, if you could get a stove from the state, then it's a difficult form to fill in. So you go to the vicar to get the vicar to fill the form in for you. And that was doing Christ's work in the community, you know. So suddenly, priests were social workers, which was what I write about in Racing Demon, and which was intensely moving to me. The idea that they loved Christ, but the only way that that love was expressed was through social work is phenomenal. And they were at the center of their communities because of that. It's
little bits of liberation theology.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When I went to, you know, Central America, I knew exactly where I was.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so teachers, as in Skylight, you know, people who work in the National Health Service, you know, anybody who is bandaging the wounds, all of which were caused by these people who were essentially intellectual vandals who destroyed the social fabric of Britain in the 1980s, and from which it's never recovered. In other words, these same people are in power, and Labour did nothing really to change. You know, Tony Blair belongs to the Thatcherite tradition. Now, when Skylight was done in New York, I had a completely false and cliched and stupid idea of the American audience. And Skylight is a dialogue between a capitalist and an entrepreneurial capitalist and someone who's, you know, working in the worst possible school. And I thought, oh, they'll all love Michael Gambon. They'll all think he's great. He's very funny, and he tells jokes, and he represents, you know, the American way. On the contrary, actually, the American audience almost more put this rush of sympathy towards the woman who's working in the sink school. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Same thing going on here then.
Totally.
Yeah.
Wow. It's a beautiful play. Those of you who haven't read it have to read it. I'm going to do the thing now of saying I've dominated enough, and it's time for you guys to ask some questions. And someone has a mic, I think. And so we'll go just think of your question here. And you guys pass it around to each other.
How you doing, Sir
Hello
David? In asking around, in the chapter on Racing Demon and the church, and asking around, you interview an amazing priest who talks about when he gets confession and it's like being punched in the face but never being able to punch back. And he says that nobody can work 7 days a week, that even he himself needs to take 1 day a week, and it's wonderful that he goes to the theater. And the idea of escapism, even in a profession that seems to have no escape because of its relationship to, I wonder how important that is to you as a writer and your commitment to writing and how much you escape.
How much I escape?
Yeah.
There isn't any escape if you're a writer, is there? Don't you? You're in the writing course?
No, I'm an actor.
Oh, you're an actor. Oh, well, you're all right then. No, the curse of being a writer is, there are writers in the room, is that your entire morale all the time is about how your writing is going. You feel great or you don't feel great according to whether things are going well on the page. And you know, you can fake a sort of cheerfulness about other things, but secretly at the back of your mind, you're thinking, I left that scene in a state of hellish disarray. I don't know what I'm doing. I mean, I'm in New York this week and it's all great, but it wasn't great at the desk last week. And I would have had a much nicer week this week in New York if I wasn't worried about the state I left the play in. And you just can't. If you're going to write, that's it. That's the life, isn't it?
Thank you.
Talking about Judas Kiss, I actually wanted to know what drew Judas Kiss.
Yeah.
What drew you to the story of Oscar Wilde, and what did you want to kind of explore or say with that particular story?
Well, the thing with Oscar Wilde is that Oscar Wilde's scholarship has moved on a lot. And it actually was that when most of the stuff that appeared about Oscar Wilde, there were two films made in the early 1960s, one with Robert Morley and one with Peter Finch. But by and large, people couldn't speak. You know, at that time, there was a limit to what could be said. And you were now able to be much more explicit. And there was also some very radical scholarship about Wilde. In particular, a book, obviously Richard Ellman is, you know, the famous great biography. And it is a great biography. But some of the little flotilla of books that were written at the same time, and particularly a New York academic called Gary Schmidgall, who wrote a book called The Stranger Wilde. And it just, they subverted some of the myths of what happened. And I'd always loved Wilde. And when I went to university and I wanted to make Wilde my special subject, I was told by the Cambridge English faculty that I could not do that because Wilde was not a serious writer and that I would be a laughingstock if I submitted a dissertation on Wilde because he was not morally serious. Yeah. Well, it's England in the 1960s. You know. And so you know, and I'd always held a torch for him, really, because I've always thought that his particular form, and he's a socialist, remember, he's an Irish socialist, you know, and the form of his socialism is terribly interesting to me. And so I didn't want to do a biographical play or film because biographical things are hell, basically, because you don't ride the bike, you know, the bike rides you. It has to go in a certain direction, and it has to go in the direction the life went. So as a writer, and I have been involved in biographical ventures, you're always just running along behind, and it's really boring because all you're doing is effectively justifying, you know, oh, at this point, she's converted to Roman Catholicism and adopts 2 children, you know, and you go, oh my God, how am I going to convert her to Roman Catholicism and adopt 2 children? You know, it's really boring because they've done it for you, and all you're doing is psychologizing. You might as well be a therapist, you know, not a creative writer. And so I then chose 2 moments which seemed to me of extreme significance and which are deeply mysterious in Wilde's life. Those moments, for those who don't know the play, are that he could have escaped before he was put on trial. And he was offered by the prosecutors the chance to escape, and he was given an afternoon at the Cadogan Hotel where he was to get the chance to get to the boat and flee, but he chose not to flee. And about that decision, Yeats said this famous thing. He said that Wilde owes his renown to that decision. And then later, having condemned his lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, and written this incredible piece of prose, De Profundis, after when he came out of jail, some of the greatest prose in the English language, I think.
And as serious as anything ever written.
As serious as exactly. About all the reasons why Bosie was a terrible person and he should never have got involved in him. He then chose to go back to him. And so there are two, what you might call perverse decisions at the heart of Wilde's life. You know, most lives depend on chance, don't they? I mean, we pretend they don't, but they do, really. But Wilde's very interesting because his life actually depends on choice. And, you know, there are not many people you can say that of. I know in drama, everybody pretends. I'm at this fork in the road and I can either do this or do that, and on that my whole future depends. You know, it's much more likely, you know, as you saw 2 weeks ago, that a wave's going to hit your house when you're least expecting it, you know? That's truer to life. But in Wilde's case, it is interesting because his destiny depends on these moments. And so I wanted to go as deep into these two moments as I possibly could, you know. And also to reclaim him from the cliches, really. I wanted him not to be going around the stage spouting famous lines. And he doesn't in my play. He spouts my lines, whether he likes it or not.
Thank you.
I mean, I think the essential point, which I then made, is that it's exactly like portraiture. My aim is not a likeness of Wilde. In fact, in the program of The Judas Kiss, which has recently been revived, I quote that wonderful quotation of Picasso's. Picasso was asked, why are your portraits not more lifelike? And Picasso replied, well, how many people do you know who are square in one dimension and you can hang them on the wall? And what his basic point is, the style of the artist is as much style as, you know, theatre is not about representation. It's not about verisimilitude. It's not waxworks, you know, it's not Madame Tussauds. It's much closer to painting than to photography. You're not seeking to show something that is, you're seeking to show something that comes through you and your style, just like a painter does. So I'm trying to add something to Wilde in my style, which I believe illuminates Wilde. I'm not trying to do a documentary.
Hi, I'm Greg Hare. I'm a third-year actor. It's nice to meet you. You spoke earlier about the tendency of a lot of drama to abstract the political, and that put me in mind of film and television, which is, I guess, a further abstraction than theater in that we're watching everything through a very specific lens. And I wonder if you feel that there's something inherently political or vital in theater that lacks in film and television, or if those are media that have the potential for the same political engagement.
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, it's just, you know, your television is in a period of great vitality, isn't it? And it's saying complex and interesting things, and, you know, I've heard nothing but, this week, I've heard nothing but everybody telling me about the difficulties and problems of it all. I'm very sorry for you all, but we're loving it. We're watching it, you know, and we're just going, great. There are these wonderful American TV series, and they're fantastic. You know,
Do you have Breaking Bad there?
Yeah. Oh, Breaking Bad, we'd never miss it, you know. And so it's just, you know, so American drama, as far as I'm concerned, is alive and well. You know, forget the gloom mongers. I mean, I'm sure it's very difficult. I'm sure it's very difficult to get good work on, but it's very difficult to get good work on in any medium at any time, because people don't know the good stuff, and also nobody knows in advance what's going to be the good stuff anyway. That's the real problem. You know, we have a moronic prime minister in England who actually said to the so-called cultural industries, well, the solution to the British film industry's problems is to make more hits. You know, and somebody pointed out to him, you know, the difficult thing about films is knowing in advance, you know. But So what I'm saying is, yes, I'm sure it's very hard in television here, and I'm sure there are all sorts of constraints, but the fact is, some fabulous work is coming through, isn't it? Great drama, with people really in. And I think one of the things it's doing, by the way, which is maybe a contentious subject, and I don't mean to depress anybody, is that I think it's making American independent cinema look a bit silly. I think that since television got good, then all those cute films about, you know, I had an interesting day with my girlfriend, and
I have a torn sweater.
She's kind of funny, but she's also kind of sad, you know. Those films don't look so bright anymore, do they? They don't, you know. They look a bit silly compared with the drive of what's going on television, you know?
And it's actually really easier now to make politically vital or interesting work or compelling or questioning work on television than it is in the theater or than it was on television ever. It's nothing but that if you want to go to the right places. Anyway, that's the thing.
I think so.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Claire.
Hello, I'm Christine Prada. I'm a third-year actor. I wanted to speak to you specifically about Racing Demon.
Yeah.
Having been raised Catholic, I was raised around a lot of clergy. There are clergy in my family. One thing that I was really inspired by in reading it was you portraying them as real people who actually have crises of faith. And I guess what I was wondering was, what was it specifically about the clergy as a human being? Because Catholics often revere their clergy as someone who has to be the Catholic that they don't have the time or the discipline to be. And I guess what I'm wondering is, what drew you specifically to the clergy in showing them as human beings?
Well, when I said that I wanted to write a play about the Church of England, nobody understood why. I mean, really, apart from the artistic director of the theatre, who, to his huge credit, said, that's really interesting, because nobody's writing about them at all. And I said, you know, they are always used in drama to be ridiculous. You know, there is always a funny scene with the vicar. And in English farce, there's a great tradition of them losing their trousers. I don't know if you know this, but there's a whole, you know, in silly English plays, there is always a scene where the vicar loses his trousers and then he gets locked in the cupboard, and then, you know, it's all that, oh, vicar, you've lost your trousers, all that. Yeah. It's just, that is how vicars appeared on the British stage until Racing Demon. And so I wanted to do them the credit of taking them seriously. And again, just like Israel-Palestine, that when I went out to see what they were doing, it was so completely different from what I was expecting. And so if you, at the beginning, of course, it's terribly funny that they don't mention God. You know, you kind of go, they have this ridiculous phrase where Church of England vicars all say, oh, we don't like to push religion down people's throats, they say, yeah. And they never mention God, you know. But they were incredibly valuable people in the communities that they lived in. So, yeah, I wanted to honor them and represent what they do. On the other hand, I also wanted to dispute with them about their beliefs. And it was a very difficult thing for a playwright who didn't believe to balance that out. And the very first review I got was from a man called Benedict Nightingale, who said, this is as good a play as can be written by somebody who doesn't believe, as if that were a disadvantage, which obviously was a very depressing review to get first. But it was never said again. It was just said that once and never said again. But I didn't believe, it's true.
Hello again.
Hello.
Hi. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about when you shared with me that I thought was really interesting about an actor's way into your work. And I think there are a fair amount of actors in here, and I think they would benefit from that as well.
Oh God,
yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if they'd benefit from it. I can only describe it to you, but if you want to protest by walking out, please do, because it's contentious. And it's only true of my work, and I can't speak for other people's work. I know that the only way to play my work is to learn it like a musical score and get it down exactly as you would get down a piece of music. If you get that piece down, you will then find that you're completely free. But you will never be free unless you accept the discipline of the text. Now, I know this sounds counterintuitive even, because I have watched actors historically come to grief in my work when they arrive intending to do it the other way around. And they say, I'm going to find the emotion in this scene. It doesn't particularly matter, you know, if it's exactly the text, you know, but I'll improvise and find my way to it, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. This to me is as mad as saying, I'll address a piece of Beethoven, but I won't actually play the notes. I just don't know what Beethoven is without the notes. I just don't know what it is. And I also don't think that actors, by and large, improvising, come up with lines which improve on what writers... I know, walk out, please do, you know. But I just... I really, you know, improvisation is a discipline. You know, if you are going to improvise, it's a discipline. Mike Leigh takes 6 months to improvise a play. John Cassavetes would spend a year working on improvisation. Improvisation is not turning up one morning and saying to the actor, why don't you say something that you just think of at that moment. And most actors anyway, presented with that, feel blind panic. They just go, why? That's not my job. You know, my job is to represent what other people have written and are happy doing that. But it's more than that. It's that unless you approach it that way, you won't find freedom within it. It'll just keep biting you. And I had this Nazi phrase, which is beyond discipline, freedom. And it is so completely true. And all actors who tackle large parts in my work hate me and feel constrained. And the first few weeks of the rehearsal are painful, particularly if they have to master large sections of extremely strange, curiously written, styled text, which is hellish to learn, with long breaths and long sentences, which is the style I may wish to work in. But until you accept the discipline of it, you won't then be free to interpret it. And then once you've accepted the discipline of it, you can't believe why you ever had a problem with it. Mm-hmm. But I've watched so many actors go through stages of anger with it because they feel, oh my God, I'm in a corset, because I can only do what the author wants me to do. But you can only promise that there are sunny uplands beyond. Now, as a director, I personally prefer that method of working anyway, on most work, certainly plays that I've been involved in. You know I'm saying something that is so against the ghost of Lee Strasberg that we should probably just pause for a second for that ghost to pass.
I don't think the method is the orthodoxy anymore.
Is it not?
Like with you guys, are you all methody and shit? No.
It's a different way in for anything you work on, I think.
It's a tool if we get stuck.
Yeah, I think this thing about precision, and you know, you do write to a certain kind of music, and once, like I actually think I've had really great experiences with, up at Williamstown, for instance, there's 2 weeks of rehearsal, so people come in knowing the text.
Oh, it's wonderful.
And then they're really free because they've actually found the breadth of it. And I think we do over-rehearse things as a ritual. And I think it's actually much simpler than it seems.
An actor friend of mine who was in a play of mine learned the whole text beforehand, but realized that this was such a violation and would intimidate other actors that he pretended to look at his script all the time.
Yeah.
But actually he didn't need to look at his script at all. And of course, you know, he was phenomenal in the play because he sort of had 4 weeks advance on everybody else because he'd spent the 4 weeks learning it. Now, in no way did he feel that his interpretation of the part was in any way limited, so to speak, by learning the words before he knew what they meant, which is what
Quite the
actors who
opposite.
object to that always say. Oh, I can't say it until I know what it means. But until you know what, you know, it's a circle, and you've got to go about it one way or the other, you know.
It's a good question.
I think a lot of problems have come from bad television, and not the kind of television we're talking about. But by and large, very good actors in Britain who do television get rubbish put in front of them, and then they say, how can we make this work? And so they're then used to the idea that a naturalistic mumble, you know, a bit of pass the salt, pass the pepper, and then them rewriting some of it and putting their favorite jokes in. And then the scene is improved. It undoubtedly is improved. But those of us who work in the theatre hope that this won't be necessary, you know.
Hello, my name is Noam Blanks. You spoke briefly about your plays as not propagandistic, and I would certainly have to agree. I was wondering if in your writing you ever go through a place of looking at it and saying, this is one-sided, this is propaganda, and turning yourself around and saying, what haven't I investigated yet? What haven't I looked into yet that makes it 360, a full picture?
I mean, I hate everything critics write about everything, so it doesn't, but it's indiscriminate, right? But I particularly object when I read that of other writers, not myself, but when they write, oh, this play's one-sided and all strong plays are two-sided, right? Now, let's just take the Diary of Anne Frank, shall we? I mean, better play, would it be, if, you know, we heard from the Nazis? You know, I don't think so.
I want to see that production.
So, I don't think there are any rules about this. If the audience is offended, what we're really talking about is if the audience doesn't believe what they see because it counters their own experience. And that is a failing in writing. If you yourself look at something on the stage and say, this is inadequate because I know more about this than the playwright does, and I know that they are missing out what it is that defines this experience, because I have had it, then yeah. And I spend a lot of time worrying about that. I spend a lot of time going, as on Skylight, but if I really were a school teacher, and if I really did choose to live in one part of London and get on a bus every day and cross London, which the character in the play does, if someone who comes to the theatre who does that, are they going to believe when they see my representation of that? There was a sort of mad journalist on The Observer in England who became so obsessed with the play that they started doing the bus journey and started writing articles about what the bus journey from Kensal Rise to Stratford East was actually like. They took the bus, and then they talked to people on the bus about whether this was a possible thing to do or not. And so, yeah, that, you do work at that, but that's not one-sided, that's incomplete, emotionally incomplete, experientially incomplete. That's what you worry about all the time. Will someone who comes to see this, who knows more about it than I do, believe this? That's what I'm worried about all the time.
Thank you.
There? Oh, I'll take it. Thank you. Hey, Charlie.
I was curious if you could speak to the musical precision that you require of, or that you expect of actors. Where's the director's role in that? And has your process with working with the director, has that changed since the days of the Chinese Revolution at Joint Stock?
Golly, what's the director's role?
Yes,
Well, goodness me.
with your plays specifically.
With my plays, well, they're an absolutely equal partner with the actors and the playwright. I don't see them as gods of the theatre, but nor do I see them as any less than actors and playwrights. They simply should be, and all the best ones I know are completely equal and committed collaborators. And also they may bring something to the play that you don't even know is there yourself. And they may, the great ones, I think, look, I gave up directing because I felt I had failed as a director in 2 productions that I did. And in both cases, I felt what I had failed to do, and I came to believe this is what a director can do, was to tell the audience what it was they were watching. And I think the really great directors are the ones who somehow, like a dog whistle, communicate to the audience what it is they are watching and how, therefore, to interpret it. Now, I don't know how they do it, the great ones, but they do that thing. They mediate between the play and the audience's reaction to it. That's what they do. And I'm thinking of my own failure to do it. I knew that I'd done a couple of pieces of work where the audience just didn't really understand what was happening on the stage, because I hadn't told them what kind of thing it was. All the signals being given out were confusing to them. And that is what I now believe the director does. And obviously that will involve the scenery, it will involve the mise en scène, it will involve the acting, but above all, it will involve an understanding of the event itself, which they are able to communicate. And how the great ones do it, I really have no idea, but I know they do it.
Hi, my name's Rosie. I'm a third-year actor. Here at this school, we're really encouraged to work collaboratively. So directors, playwrights, and actors all working together, often to create new work. I would really just love to hear what you would urge for us as the next generation of the American theater, what you would like to see the next generation doing here in the theater.
Well, it's obvious what I will say, because Robbie really has said it already, which is that I would love that theatre to look outwards. Of course I would. And to take in material that, to widen the breadth of material that you cover. In other words, there may be more wealth to be found in re-examination of the American experience. There may be, and there may be great things to be written on that subject. But there may also be great things on other subjects which have not been written about. And all I ever wanted to do in the theatre was to introduce material that nobody else seemed, it just seemed to be missing 3/4 of life. It just seemed to be all about things that were just this tiny sliver of life. So if I've done the Chinese Revolution, or aid to the Third World, or the Church of England, or the privatization of the railway system, or the diplomatic process leading up to the war in Iraq, it's to refresh the bloody theatre so that it's not always about the same boring things over and over and over. Now, the only way of doing that is by looking outwards. But of course, when you look outwards, you will, of course, inevitably, thereby look inwards. Of course you will. Because the minute you go to a place about which you show curiosity, you also begin to examine things in yourself. But that, to me, is what really important or interesting writing does, or interesting exploration in the theatre does. Look at Black Watch, it tells you about something that you don't already know about. And so that is always exciting to me. So expand the terrain, would be my message.
If I can just go add to that, there's two kinds of an experience available to theater people, or and actors in particular here. And one is this sort of careerist path. And it's sort of, you end up being sort of funneled into meetings with agents and then maybe going out to the coast and stuff, which is important and admirable. But I also think that part of the effort of looking outward is, for God's sake, trying to stay in New York for as long as you actually can and live a life of doing plays. And when, you know, my shrink always says, don't take action, let the action take you. When it's time for you to go to the coast and go traipsing, you know, from one ghastly sitcom to another, you will, you know. But it's something about staying here. And also the happiest actors I've known, the only actors I've known who haven't caught this terrible disease that is offered by show business are the ones who've actually stayed here. So there's a difference between blah, blah, blah.
Hi. What is your process in finding out what you want to write about? How do you know, how do you discover, how do you decide what is the next theme, or what are the questions that you want to answer in your plays?
Oi, oi, oi. I've said this to the playwriting class. Personally, I like a nice visual image. I like, you know, if I go to a play and there's something on the stage when I arrive, and now we don't have curtains anymore, so there's probably a set, and I look at the set, and I like the look of it, the visual of it. I go, oh, you know, this feels great, this is going to be wonderful. And so oh, I like being here. You know, Tom Stoppard, I read, he said he wrote 3 plays, you know, The Coast of Utopia, that took him 5 years to write, because he'd walked into the Olivier one day and liked the look of a set in there before the curtain even went up, and went, ooh, I must write a play to go on in the Olivier. I really want to play in here, right? So he wrote 3, which took him 5 years, and it was just that shock of, this looks great. If I had a play in here, it'd be great, because I can think of a visual image. And so for me, that's what gets me going, is not the theatre thing, but the thing of, I know that in a painterly way, I love what this image will be, you know? That's very, very important to me. Which is why I like proscenium arches and I like proper theatres, because I like the completion of the visual image, personally. I don't dictate it for everybody, but I went screaming mad when the original plan was to do Skylight in the Traverse, and you know, with the audience on 2 sides. I just said, well, A, you destroy my visual image, which, you know, is all I care about. And B, I go to the theatre to look at the actors, not at the rest of the audience, personally. I'm not, I know there are people who love looking at the other, but to me, the idea of those Traverse things where you sit staring at other people crossing and uncrossing their legs, it's not. I'd rather watch Michael Gambon, personally, and not have to look through Michael Gambon to the other. But that's my style of work, you know. That may not be true for other people, but that's what I prefer. Yeah. So the visual is the answer. So you feel, oh, this is rich, loamy turf on which to write a play, is what you feel. You feel, oh, wow, this smells like rich turf.
Yeah. A few more questions, and that's the thing. You can do it.
Hi. You've written some pretty phenomenal female characters in your work, and they seem often to be agents for change or representations of even hope. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about what it is about women what drove you to write women in that way?
Because the feminist movement happened at exactly the moment that I was growing up. And so it, the first play I wrote, the first full-length play I wrote was about feminism. And so it was the most dynamic political movement for a long time. And it just seemed to me completely ridiculous that 50% of people's, 50% of the people should be represented by 10% of the roles. It just made no sense to me. In the theatre, I couldn't understand it, and I didn't. So it wasn't even a campaign. It's not like I've done it out of any, I'm not crusading about it. But the relationships between men and women were changing in very radical ways when I was young, and so, all sorts of styles of behaviour were shifting between the genders. And so because of that, it was very interesting to record and write about. And I could also see that I was excited by the other. In other words, I'm not an autobiographical writer. I'm not remotely interested to write about myself. And an active imagination is what gets me going. So what greater active imagination can there be than to try and imagine what it's like to be a woman? I can't ever be one. So what's exciting to me is I'm immediately doing something which is stimulating to my imagination. So the minute you put the woman at the center of the stage, all sorts of interesting things begin to happen, particularly in power relationships within the drama. And so that just became a way of looking at the world, I suppose. Because so much that was written about women in the theatre seemed to me false. So that's really the answer.
Thank you.
Hello again. Yesterday, yes, in our Theatre of Anger class, you spoke about what you called the problem of aesthetics.
Yeah.
And I, as an actor, I went home and said, I've never thought about it that way, and I absolutely agree. And maybe we should start by telling those who weren't in the room what you were talking about. But then I tried to reconcile the profession I've chosen with that problem, because it seems like I'm spending an enormous amount of time and effort trying to work on aesthetics, and I don't know how to go towards the issue instead. So, please help.
I can't. What we were talking about was the fact that theatre is basically a hobbyist's medium. In other words, the core audience is people who go to every Hamlet, and they say, I liked Kevin Kline's Hamlet, but Sam Waterston's wasn't as good, but I particularly enjoyed Ken Branagh, but on the other hand, I was very disappointed by Mark Rylance. And they are essentially collectors, and what they're after is something aesthetic, meaning that it's the pleasures of the decor is different at this one, the lighting was better at that one. They're not terribly worried about the question to be or not to be. That is not what they're going to Hamlet for, to contemplate that question. They're going to contemplate how good an actor you are. That's what they're there for, aesthetic reasons, And so when I was young, the answer to that question of aesthetics was to smash aesthetics completely, put the play on in a deliberately ugly way, stick some lights up in this room, have the guy doing the tape recorder in sight, turn the lights on come the actors, we're not trying to pretend this is anything it isn't. We're not aiming for, you know, the complete fresco. We're just going to sketch in and hope that that will make you concentrate. But as I described yesterday, the problem was as soon as that kind of theatre begins, then a school of that kind of theatre begins to exist. Other groups start doing the same things. You go to a touring date and somebody says, well, you were very good this week, but last week we had the People Show or the Pip Simmons group. They were much better than you were. And in particular, I like their costumes much more, and the lighting was much better last week. And so aesthetics is like the sea. It just rises all the time. And it swamps everything. You can't stop people seeing things aesthetically rather than, as it were, morally. And so what do you finally do? Give in, I suppose. I mean, that's what I've done. In other words, I've tried to master the main stage and I've tried to perfect my aesthetics to a point where, you know, they can't say that my lighting is worse than last week's. But it undoubtedly is a problem. And everyone who works in the theatre feels a discontent with it. They feel a restlessness about it. And there must be some way of doing this which is less silly, you know? And that, you know, I was today talking to the director, Sam Gold. And, you know, Sam was describing to me how he tries to make actors act without appearing to act. And all of us feel that kind of discontent with the pretense. And you go through periods of both either embracing the pretense and loving it, or you go through periods of trying to smash it up a bit, you know. And there isn't any answer, is there?
Is that it?
I think it may be.
Yeah, I think, are we, that's great. No, I meant that. Thank you so much, David. This has been a great week having you here. And we're I don't know, I think everybody was really happy that they got to spend some time with the playwright ever. Do you want to say anything?